Good afternoon. I'm Peter Carmichael, the Director of the Civil War Institute here at Gettysburg College. It's my pleasure to welcome Megan Keith Nelson. Megan is a writer, historian, and cultural critic. She has taught at a number of institutions, Texas Tech, at Cal State Fullerton, Harvard, and most recently at Brown University. She's now based in Lincoln, Massachusetts. She writes regularly for the New York Times Disunion blog, for Civil War Times, and she is the author of a very important book called Ruined Nation, published by the University of Georgia. She's also published a number of articles, including a piece in a volume entitled, great title, Weirding the War. Weirding the War by Stephen Barry. She has a piece in there. And in all of Megan's work, she brings a much-needed cultural perspective to the study of the Civil War. The marriage between military history and cultural history has been a long time coming. I think she's at the very forefront of that scholarship, and you will get to sort of see her thinking unfold in her new blog, which will be released in a few weeks. That's released in a few weeks, called Historista. Historista, and of course, what Megan is really dedicated to, and if anyone can pull it off, it will be her. She's trying to make Civil War history hip. And I think you're going to do it. So today she's going to speak about Ruins of Revenge, the Burning of Chambersburg.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for coming to this session. And thanks to Pete and the rest of the CWI staff. I was here 2 years ago. Talking about ruined bodies, so I thought I'd come back again and talk about ruined buildings this time. And my goal actually in the blog, my goal is to get Pete to actually like blogs. So we'll have to get a report from him after a couple months. We'll see if he's an avid reader. Okay. So the wheat harvest had just begun, and the farmers were uneasy. Twice before, they had endured raids as they carted their bounty in from the fields. The enemy had taken their horses and their wagons in addition to their grain. Rumors of rebels on the border spread around the town. They had to be vigilant. In the cool dark of a late summer morning, citizen sentries fell back into Chambersburg, a bustling town at a crossroads in south-central Pennsylvania. The rumored rebels were approaching. The day broke calm and sultry, and soon the center of town was filled with Confederates. A demand was made, a ransom. The citizens could not pay it. Within 20 minutes, the town was on fire in a dozen places. Families fled from houses with only the clothing on their backs. The sick and the old were carried from the towns into the fields. When it was all over, the center of Chambersburg had become a mass of crumbling walls, stacks of chimneys, and smoking embers. During a time in which warfare was understood to be a contest between armies in the field, not a series of actions against civilians, how could this happen? And why did both Confederate and Union troops take aim at American cities, torching commercial buildings, warehouses, stables, and homes during the American Civil War? Well, they did this for many reasons, some of which have to do with military strategy, and some of which have to do with the nature of American urbanization. In the United States, urban centers developed in such a way that they included both centers of civic life, so county courthouses, city halls, and centers of production, factories and warehouses. And because the American Civil War was a political and an economic conflict, in addition to a military conflict, American towns and cities invited attack. Thus, the major campaigns of the Union armies between 1861 and 1865 were focused on reaching, taking, and sometimes destroying the South's urban centers. They targeted some towns and cities for their productive capacities and others for their strategic locations. Others simply happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. They stood in the path of armies on their way to other destinations. The destruction was rarely total. Most urban ruination was targeted, focused on the manufacturing and business districts. But of course, fire cannot be controlled. Fredericksburg, Charleston, Columbia, and Atlanta, most prominently, lost more than 1/3 of their buildings, both commercial and domestic, as a result of Union military strategies and occupation. Confederate soldiers did their own share of burning. Sometimes they destroyed their own cities as a defensive strategy. Hampton, Virginia, parts of Atlanta, and most of Richmond's business district got the torch as Confederates evacuated these cities, retreating before overwhelmingly large Union armies. The thought here was that they would destroy their own war material before the Union's advancing armies could get at it. But Confederates also burned some towns and cities in offensive maneuvers. During their 1862 and 1863 campaigns into Maryland and Pennsylvania, during cavalry raids on southern Unionist towns, and during guerrilla campaigns in the border region. The burning of Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, on July 30th, 1864, was one such offensive act of destruction. It is an unusual and interesting example of this wartime practice and responses to it for several reasons. First, it was a northern town in a northern and not a border state. Second, the conversations about the smoking ruins of Chambersburg shifted the discussion of civilized warfare, pitting northern civilians against northern military and government officials, rather than pitting Union soldiers against Confederate civilians. Third, the Chambersburg ruins exemplify the debate about retaliation as a legitimate military strategy. And fourth, they illuminate the ways that destruction demanded the assignment of responsibility in wartime. So at the time of its burning, Chambersburg was celebrating its centennial. Although European immigrants, most of them Irish, German, or Scotch-Irish, had been living in the Cumberland Valley of the colony of Pennsylvania since the 1730s, the town's founder, Benjamin Chambers, did not lay out its streets until July 1764. Chambersburg grew slowly but steadily, helped by its location, as you can see on this map, on the Braddock Fords Military Road, which connected Pittsburgh with points eastward, and its designation as the Franklin County seat in 1784. Its population burgeoned after the Cumberland Valley Railroad opened its Chambersburg line, connecting Hagerstown, Maryland, with the Pennsylvania state capital at Harrisburg in November 1837. The city's status as a travel hub and a political center spurred the construction of hotels, taverns, and a courthouse in the antebellum period. Entrepreneurial residents built factories producing hats, tools, paper, and iron. The significantly large German population also supported the establishment of several breweries and distilleries. The streets of the business district, nicknamed the Diamond due to the shape of the town's central square, were lined with 2 to 3 story brick and frame structures housing both businesses and apartments. The mansions of Chambersburg's business leaders stood on adjacent streets. In 1860, there were 800 buildings in Chambersburg, with 5,255 people living there. By the summer of 1864, however, Chambersburg had experienced more than 50% population decline due to the deployment of soldiers and the evacuation of residents during the Confederate campaigns of 1862 and 1863. At the time of the burning, therefore, there were about 2,500 people living in the town. During that summer, with the Army of Northern Virginia pinned at Petersburg and Union General David Hunter attempting to subdue the Shenandoah Valley, Confederate General Robert E. Lee sent Jubal Early's corps to the valley to deal with Hunter and hopefully divert some of Grant's troops from Washington, D.C. To kind of combat this threat. If some of you were at Katie Meyer's talk in the session right before this one, you now know a lot about Early. If you're at that talk, you're sort of pulling the double Early right now. And you know a lot about him and his campaigns during this period, and if you would like to know more about him and his maneuverings and how they affected his reputation, you can catch Dr. Meyer in the hallway and besiege her with questions. Early's men moved quickly and managed to surprise the soldiers garrisoned around Washington, D.C. before withdrawing to the valley, destroying railroads and bridges as they went. In late July, Early learned that in his absence, Hunter had returned to the Shenandoah and what Early called his favorite mode of warfare, burning the homes of prominent Confederates. As he noted in his memoir, Early came to the conclusion that we had stood this mode of warfare long enough, and on July 26th, he dispatched 2 brigades and a battery of artillery under John McCausland to Chambersburg. He instructed McCausland to demand of the municipal authorities the sum of $100,000 in gold or $500,000 in United States currency as a compensation for the destruction of the houses named, those belonging to prominent Confederates, including a relative of Lee's, and their contents. This ransom demand, if successful, would provide much needed currency to purchase supplies for the Southern troops, whose own Confederate dollars were by this time almost worthless. And I should note here that Early had successfully wrested both money and supplies from a number of towns in Maryland before this: Hagerstown, Frederick, Middletown, and Boonesboro, with this strategy. If McCausland was unsuccessful in securing the ransom, Early's orders read, he was to lay the town in ashes in retaliation for the burning of those houses and others in Virginia, as well as for the towns which had been burned in southern states. McCausland and his men reached Chambersburg on the morning of July 30th. After establishing a battery on a hillside outside of town, the Confederates threw a few shells that were meant, according to Virginia Cavalryman J. Scott Moore, to intimidate rather than harm. I doubt that the residents saw it that way. Meanwhile, the 8th Virginia Cavalry dismounted and began to pour through the streets and alleys, converging at the Diamond, which Moore admitted was the objective point. As Chambersburg residents left their homes and joined them, McCausland and his adjutant general read Early's order aloud and asked that the city council assemble to discuss the ransom and collect the money. The town's citizens, Moore wrote, seemed to think we were jesting and bluffing. Then they asked time to consider. Now, there are different reports of how much time they were given. Moore claims it was 1 hour. McCausland argues it was 6 hours. Several of Chambersburg's residents swore that they were allowed no time at all. As in other towns and cities, Fredericksburg, Virginia most notably, this issue of notification before a siege or destruction became a matter of real controversy, and it suggests that in 1864, the matter of fair warning in hard war against civilians was still in dispute. But Chambersburg's leaders were not asking for time in order to gather funds. At the first rumor of Confederates in the area, the city's merchants and bankers had sent all of their merchandise and their money northward. The city council could not have paid the ransom if they had wanted to. Rather, in asking for several hours to discuss it, Chambersburg's leaders were stalling for time. They hoped the Union forces in the area would come to their aid. McCausland saw this tactic for what it was and almost immediately formed a detail and ordered the men to set fire to the town at different locations. The flames spread quickly, despite the relatively calm day. Moore was impressed with the conflagration, which in his view was one of surpassing grandeur and terror. The tall columns of black smoke rose up to the very skies. Around it were wrapped long streams of flames, writhing and twisting themselves into 1,000 fantastic shapes. Many observers noted how the fire seemed to create its own kind of weather. Whirlwinds of fire lifted clothing and wood and bricks and furniture into the air and hurled them across the city. Within 2 hours, most of the buildings in the Diamond were destroyed, as were many of the houses of prominent civilians that lined the surrounding streets. Now, we do not have images of the fire itself. First of all, it's difficult in this period to take photographs of anything moving quickly. And also, no photographers were really there. No one was expecting this to happen. No artists were on hand to depict it. However, photographers flocked to the city over the next few weeks, as did tourists. And the photographers created stereographic views of Chambersburg's ruins to sell to a wider public and to national newspapers and magazines for reproduction as illustrations. They produced 2 kinds of ruin images, One kind, the kinds pictured here in this slide, which were landscape of ruins images. They're sort of long views of entire blocks, or in this case, in the top image, a view from a prospect, probably from a church tower, where you can see the entire city and you can see the ruins sort of in situ. They also produced street views, so the photographers were standing in the street, giving you a view of the ruins. It was quite popular to stand at the corner of streets and take ruin photographs here. I should note, we have so many photographs of urban ruins because urban ruins are very photogenic. The reason for this is because they don't move, right? So their sharp angles become quite clear in these photographs at this point, which necessitated a longer exposure time. Also, almost all photographers took photographs of ruins from angles so that you could see the spaces, you could see the lack of roofs, you could see the shard of wall, and this is a very pleasing kind of prospect and angle from which to view any kind of landscape image. We also have pictures, so here's another picture, a kind of stunning stereograph of the northwest corner of the public square, so you can see how this building no longer exists, it's just a single wall. The other effect that these images had, even though the caption gives you a kind of address, they are disorienting in nature, right? You know where you are, but it looks so different from the town as it looked only a couple hours before, that it creates a sort of disconcerting notion of chaos in the viewer. Also quite popular are what I call ruin portraits, individual buildings that have been destroyed, that have been significant before the destruction as single buildings. The most popular ruin in Chambersburg was the ruin of the Diamond Central and its most important civic building. And part of the reason that this was such a popular image also is because those columns are left standing, right? And they really evoke the ruins of Greece. And made that connection with historical empires and destruction. The Bank of Chambersburg was also a popular photographic subject. So these photographs started being produced, and Harper's Weekly, as they often did, got into the game, and they purchased many of these and created illustrations out of them, and they published a triptych, a group of 3 illustrations, in their August 20th issue, so less than 3 weeks after the fire, depicting the ruins of Chambersburg, including both street views, like this one, of Main Street, and then also individual portraits, like this of the bank and the Franklin Hotel, and then the town hall. So these images really helped spread the news of Chambersburg, especially across the north, and helped northerners really visually access the destruction. They were appealing, they were visually appealing, but they were also emotionally and intellectually shocking to those who looked at these images or visited the ruins themselves. Mostly because of this contrast that I already mentioned about what that building was before and then what it had become. As a viewer, you're invited to sort of contemplate the process of destruction when you look at an image like this. Now, the residents of Chambersburg had a very different relationship to these ruins, of course, because these buildings were theirs. They were also riveted and shocked, but they acted very quickly in response to the destruction. A civilian committee was formed, comprised of Chambersburg residents whose property had not been destroyed. This committee ultimately determined that 559 of the town's 800 buildings had been burned, 270 residences and places of business, 98 barns and stables, and 173 outbuildings of various kinds. And they produced a map of the burnt district for publication, which often accompanied printed accounts of the burning of Chambersburg. But it was not all about the numbers and the property values. As the Reverend Benjamin Bousman noted sadly in the days after the fire, it was not just buildings that were destroyed, but portraits, books, and family keepsakes of 50 years gathering. Lying among the rubble of his home was every domestic memorial, which piety and affection have gathered for more than half a century. These were not mere objects, items purchased and displayed and disconnected from those who owned them. They were the domestic and social ties that bound the members of communities and of families together. Chambersburg was a ruin of revenge. It was chosen, targeted for destruction in a deliberate and focused act of military retaliation. But why Chambersburg? Why would Early select this town to burn in revenge for Union depredations in Virginia? There were several theories at the time. Perhaps its many factories and storehouses attracted Confederates bent on destroying the Union war machine. Or maybe Early had remembered that the town was a stop on the Underground Railroad. This is why the abolitionist firebrand John Brown established a supply depot there and met there with Frederick Douglass to discuss his Harper's Ferry plan in 1859. Some argued Chambersburg was just one of several towns in the region that received visits from Confederates under Early and threats of destruction and demands for money and supplies. The reason Chambersburg was burned is because they did not comply, right? They did not pay. Others have argued, however, that the decision was rooted in previous experience. After all, the Confederates had been in Chambersburg twice before. In October 1862, Confederate cavalry under Jeb Stuart visited the town on one of their famous circumnavigations of the Union Army. They spent the night there, helped themselves to a cache of clothing meant for Union soldiers, and burned buildings belonging to the railroad and a storehouse containing war material. Stuart returned to the area the next summer, and this time with Robert E. Lee. In late June 1863, 60,000 Confederate soldiers began to converge in Chambersburg, and Lee established his headquarters there. The town escaped large-scale destruction at this point, mostly due to Lee's General Orders number 73, which reminded Confederate soldiers that we make war only upon armed men, and that no greater disgrace should befall an army and through it our whole people, than the perpetration of the barbarous outrages upon the unarmed and defenseless and the wanton destruction of private property. Also, soldiers did not have much time for looting and burning. They departed within days to meet Union troops at Gettysburg. After such close calls in the first 2 years of the war, Chambersburg residents didn't know what to think. In the summer of 1864, some believed that the town was destined for destruction. Others lapsed into a kind of apathy. They were convinced that Chambersburg had escaped before and would escape again. But if fate was really such a powerful force in Chambersburg's wartime experience, then it was geographic destiny. For as Maryland Confederate cavalryman Fielder Springluff put it, Chambersburg became a target because it was the nearest and the most accessible place of importance for us to get to. So let's go back to this map here. So Chambersburg sits in the cradle of the Cumberland Valley, which extends from central Pennsylvania to Maryland. South of the Potomac, the Cumberland becomes the Shenandoah, one of the major battlegrounds of the war. Confederates had control of the valley for the first 3 years of the conflict, and they used it as a corridor from which to threaten Washington, D.C., and to launch invasions of the Union in 1862 and 1863. So in 1864, Chambersburg was a small city on a well-used and familiar transportation corridor in southern Franklin County, the most exposed portion of the Pennsylvania border. Early later explained, with what one imagines is a shrug, and I'm paraphrasing here to make it specific to Chambersburg, but I did not select Chambersburg as having more merit or greater claims for retaliation than others, but because it sat within the limits of the country covered by my command and was brought more immediately to my attention. So in other words, Early chose Chambersburg because it was there. The more controversial issue than the choice of Chambersburg was the motivation for the burning of the city itself. Southerners had never actually actually been averse to destroying towns and cities as long as they were northern towns and cities. Tennessee Confederate Annie Maney, for example, advocated the Confederacy's use of hard war tactics in a letter to her friend in May of 1861. "I only pray God may be with us," she wrote, "to give us strength to conquer them, to exterminate them, to lay waste to every northern city, town, and village, to destroy them utterly." So, words of a teenage girl. Jefferson Davis echoed Maney's sentiments in an 1861 speech in Stevenson, Alabama, vowing that we will carry war where food for the sword and torch await our armies, in the densely populated cities of the North. Union troops might burn Southern crops, but we can raise them as before, while they cannot rear the cities which took years of industry and millions of money to build. Such bloody-mindedness focused on the destruction of northern cities was common throughout the South from the war's earliest days, and it only increased as the war progressed. As the hills, valleys, and lowlands of the South were trampled, cut over, and burned out during long-term and hard war campaigns on both sides, Southern civilians became increasingly insistent in their calls for an invasion of the North and retaliation in kind. But what of the laws of warfare? Accepted military theories provided very little guidance and a lot of wiggle room in this regard. Retaliation, also referred to as reciprocity, was a rule frequently adopted in operations of war. The Union's Lieber Code of 1863, for example, argued that although retaliation was the sternest feature of war, the law of war can no more wholly dispense with retaliation than can the law of nations. Retaliation was considered a legitimate justification for military action in two ways. First, it was considered a just response to barbarous outrages on the part of the enemy. For Jubal Early, these outrages constituted not only the destruction of property, but also savage attacks on Southern white women. "I had often seen delicate ladies," he wrote, "who had been plundered, insulted, and rendered desolate by the acts of our most atrocious enemies. And while they did not call for it, yet in the anguished expressions of their features while narrating their misfortunes, there was a mute appeal to every manly sentiment of my bosom for retribution." Second, as a war measure, retaliation, which was seen as something slightly different from just pure revenge, was seen as a thoughtful and considered act of protective retribution. And this is where things really get wild. Soldiers could engage in retaliation if they believed the act would prevent the enemy from executing barbarous outrages in the future. So, any officer or soldier on either side of the conflict could justify destruction as necessary and just retribution for previous acts by the enemy, or as a preemptive strike against future possible acts. So one can see how this might provoke some confusion, and also a never-ending cycle of vengeance. Jubal Early very clearly saw the burning of Chambersburg as justified retaliation in both of these senses. He made sure to point out that the policy pursued by our army on former occasions had been lenient, and he had restrained his officers and soldiers from pillaging in previous trips northward. But now Hunter's acts were so excessive that they demanded a response. Early regretted the necessity of this act, a local newspaper reported, but he believed he was only doing his duty to those people who had suffered by General Hunter's orders. He and other Confederates also believed, or rather hoped, that the burning of Chambersburg would open the eyes of the people of other towns at the north to the necessity of urging upon their government the adoption of a different policy. So here was a slightly different argument, right? To Southerners, it seemed like Northern citizens either exulted in or ignored the destruction of Southern towns, functionally condoning it. As the editors of the Washington, D.C. paper, the National Intelligencer, explained, partly from the remoteness of the scene of such wrongdoing, and partly from a languid sense of indignation in all that concerns the misfortune of the enemy, there was no very vivid or universal feeling on the subject of the destruction of Southern towns. The burning of Chambersburg, Southerners felt, would jolt Northerners out of this kind of apathy. As the editors of the Richmond Enquirer crowed ecstatically, "We have lit in Chambersburg a blaze that will arrest the view of the Northern people and illustrate the destruction of villages, homesteads, and towns in every Southern state." Of course, many Northerners, and especially the inhabitants of Chambersburg, protested against the burning and argued that Early's destruction of an entire northern city as retribution for the destruction of a handful of Southern homes, as outlined in his order to McCausland, was itself an excessive act of violence, a monstrosity. However, as military theorist and Union General Henry Halleck argued in 1864, in times of war, it might not be possible to punish the individual responsible for egregious acts, Hunter, and in those cases, a larger body could be held responsible. In wartime, Halleck reasoned, a city, an army, or an entire community is sometimes punished for the illegal acts of its rulers or individual members. Southerners looked with scorn upon the protests of Northerners after the burning of Chambersburg. There's a great howl being raised over this vandalism all over the North, Alabama Colonel David Huntley wrote sarcastically, and those howl loudest who have been the most outspoken advocates of the indiscriminate pillage and slaughter of the suffering inhabitants of our Southern states. While he wished that the Confederacy had not stooped to the level of the Yankees and burned the city, Huntley believed this act of ruination had the added benefit of revealing that never was there before as errant a nation of hypocrites and cowards as these Northmen. Some Northerners, however, pointed out that it was Southerners who were hypocrites. Charles Coffin, a Northern journalist, noted derisively that the ruins of Chambersburg are evidence of the tender mercy of the rebels who had boasted so loudly of their restraint in war. Such vengeful acts were inherently contradictory. They subverted their own stated goal of preemptive violence and provoked additional acts of revenge. Northern soldiers did use the destruction of Chambersburg to justify and sometimes fuel their actions against Confederate soldiers and civilians in the summer and fall of 1864. After the Confederates withdrew from the smoldering city and retreated across the Potomac, Union cavalry under General William Averell pursued them, catching up to them in Virginia. Many Northern accounts of this skirmish contend that the charging Union cavalry yelled, "Remember Chambersburg," and "Surrender, you house-burning villains," as they shot at the enemy. Union soldiers even further afield considered their actions to be part of this cycle of vengeance. Allen Campbell, who took part in the destruction of Atlanta's business district as Sherman's troops left it in November 1864, considered that Chambersburg is dearly paid for. Not all Northerners and not all citizens of Chambersburg harbored these angry feelings and desires for vengeance after the burning, however. In the weeks after the fire, many residents of Chambersburg focused on cleaning up the rubble and salvaging what they could out of the ruins. And in regard to the feelings of revenge, so natural to the human heart, the Reverend B.S. Schneck wrote with satisfaction, "I have been gratifyingly disappointed." Whether Schneck's idealistic vision of his fellow Chambersburg residents' moral uprightness after the destruction of the city was realistic, it is unclear. However, it is true that the chroniclers of the event spent very little time contemplating revenge in their accounts. This was not because they lacked a person on whom to focus their vengeful thoughts. Unlike William Tecumseh Sherman and Wade Hampton after the destruction of Columbia, South Carolina, Jubal Early never once denied responsibility for the burning of Chambersburg. His order to McCausland and his notice to the citizens of Chambersburg were quite overt about the reasons for burning the town. In his public remarks at the time, he accepted responsibility in a calm, firm manner. And in his memoirs, Early noted, "For this act, I alone am responsible, as the officers engaged in it were simply executing my orders and had no discretion left them." He declared himself perfectly satisfied with my conduct on this occasion and see no reason to regret it. While Chambersburg residents did lavish attention on barbaric acts of pillaging and theft and denounced the fiendishness of Early's order, interestingly, neither Early nor Confederate soldiers were the villains in Northern narratives of the event. Instead, Chambersburg's ruins provoked a debate over responsibility that added a new twist to discussions about civilized warfare, focusing on Northern military personnel and the citizens of Chambersburg themselves. The residents of Chambersburg had hoped that stalling for time would bring Union soldiers to their aid. But the residents of the Maryland-Pennsylvania borderlands had, for some time, been without any military protection, which somewhat shocked the Confederate J. Scott Moore. Because at the time, General Couch, this is Moore writing in his account, at the time, General Couch was encamped at Mercersburg, 16 miles distant, with a battery and a force of men, and General Averill was encamped at Greencastle, 10 miles distant, with 2,500 cavalry. So the question was, why did they permit us to burn Chambersburg? Chambersburg residents had the same question. They collected their neighbors' stories of the terrible catastrophe, and they published them in articles and pamphlets, and they spent considerable time pondering this question, usually under the heading, "Who is responsible?" Rather than blaming Early, who had so directly and unabashedly claimed responsibility, or McCausland, they focused instead on the Union Army and the state of Pennsylvania. The responsibility of this fearful and atrocious incursion, one resident declared confidently, rests undeniably with the military authorities. More specifically, Harper's Weekly reported, much blame has been thrown upon General Couch. In 1864, Union Major General Darius Couch was the head of the Department of the Susquehanna and was therefore responsible for the defense of Pennsylvania. He was, as Moore noted, stationed in Mercersburg. However, he only had between 100 and 200 men and one section of one battery, which was 2 guns, available to fight on July 30th. The rest of his command, ironically, had been sent to Washington, D.C. a few weeks before to defend against Early's raid. Or they had been transferred by request to William Averill in Greencastle. To many residents, when they sort of heard about this lack of available manpower proved that Couch was not accountable for the burning. He could not have defended the town, with such scanty numbers. To do so would have meant certain death or capture. William Averill, on the other hand, was even closer to Chambersburg than Couch, encamped only 10 miles away. In a move that helped to clear his name afterwards, Couch sent 4 urgent telegraph messages to Averill, warning him of the approach of McCausland and the Confederates and requesting orders. The third and rather desperate telegram read, "The enemy are just at the edge of town. Let me know what you intend doing." Rumors abounded as to why Averill never responded to Couch's messages. According to Thomas Bard, who's a Maryland Unionist who was traveling with the Union telegraph officers that night, the first 2 messages were never delivered because the orderlies could not locate Averill. After receiving the 3rd message, Bard went off on his own to find Averill. As he heard the first guns fire in Chambersburg just before dawn on the 30th, he found Averill asleep by the side of a fence in an open field. According to him, Averill's response was less than heroic. Without rising to put his troops in motion, or without the slightest manifestation of interest in the condition of General Couch, or in the peril to which the loyal people of Chambersburg were exposed, he merely said, "Tell Couch, I will be there in the morning." Now, many residents of the town concluded that if Averill had only awakened fully from his sleep and moved toward Chambersburg, the town would have been saved. But he did not. Later that morning, he found himself and his 2,500 men flanked by the Confederates and chose to place his command between the enemy and Baltimore rather than coming to Chambersburg's aid. He and his men finally made it to Chambersburg around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, marched through its smoldering ruins, and then pursued McCausland's men to the Potomac. Although Harper's Weekly charitably concluded that it is clearly impossible that Couch or any other general could protect Pennsylvania from being at some point infested with rebels, many Chambersburg and Franklin County residents argued that Averill's lack of action made him the delinquent, the one who could and should have saved us. So, in a time of war and at a vulnerable moment for Union patriotism, Grant's overland campaign was sort of stalled in Petersburg. Sherman was making progress, but slow progress in Georgia. Why would Chambersburg residents find fault with their own generals, with the state of Pennsylvania, which they felt had left them defenseless in the wartime frontier? Well, one reason is that they were building a case for compensation. The Confederate government certainly would not compensate them for their losses, nor would the Union Army, which had already established a policy that claims growing out of destruction of property for military necessity, or what they called the fortunes of war, were disallowed. But the residents of Chambersburg believed they had a good case to claim compensation from the state of Pennsylvania, given the responsibility of the state for the local defense. They argued that the lack of soldiers in the area under both Couch and Averill prevented any possible protection of the city. So that citizens committee, who went through tracking all that property destruction and creating the map and publishing the accounts, they did all of that intending to use the information as evidence for their claims. The committee established that real estate losses in Chambersburg amounted to about $780,000. To this was added an estimate of personal property losses, a little over $900,000. The state of Pennsylvania responded to claims beginning in February 1866, when the legislature passed an act appropriating $500,000 to compensate the property owners of Chambersburg on a pro rata basis. One wonders if anyone noted the irony of that sum, given that it is the exact amount demanded by Early to ransom the city. Over the next 5 years, the state reviewed property assessments and claims like this one. This is B.S. Schnack's claim for damages for about $6,700. So they went over this, and in May 1871 appropriated another $300,000 for compensation, and Schnack here had his claim approved later that summer. By the late 1880s, residents were still arguing that Pennsylvania should pay another $800,000 to the citizens of Chambersburg. As one of them wrote, "It is the duty of the state to protect her citizens, and if she fail in that, she should pay and make good any losses occasioned by her failure to protect them." But the citizens of Chambersburg were not in it just for the money. They also compiled all of these accounts and published all of these letters about the burnings and all these documents and blamed the Union Army and the state of Pennsylvania in order to protect their own reputations. B.S. Schnack noted on the first page of his pamphlet, The Burning of Chambersburg, that his description of the terrible calamity was directed in part at those who are ready, either from ignorance or something worse, to misrepresent the facts in the case. He was referring to journalists reporting for the New York Herald and the New York Tribune, who had blamed not Couch, or Averill, or Early, or McCausland, but the citizens of the city themselves. Chambersburg residents, these newspapers argued, were unpatriotic, apathetic, capitulating, cowards. The editors of the Franklin Repository responded to such depictions with outrage in their August 31st, 1864 issue. arguing that the heartlessness exhibited by some of the New York papers in reference to the burning of our once beautiful and flourishing town and the subsequent suffering and distress of our citizens is without a parallel in the annals of brutality. They even went so far as to blame the editors of the Herald and the Tribune themselves individually for advocating hard war policies and provoking Confederate retaliation. Such a pernicious policy, they argued, is now bearing bitter fruit. These accusations turned formerly friendly neighbors into enemies, creating an internal war of words within the Mid-Atlantic press. And I should also note, this is kind of a victory, right, for those Confederates who saw the burning of Chambersburg as an object lesson, that now all Northerners would sort of turn against all hard war policy. Much of the criticism from New York was rooted in the belief that a city the size of Chambersburg should have been able to protect itself from McCausland's cavalry. Residents defended against this argument by noting that they had sent a large number of their family members to fight in Union regiments. And as I noted at the beginning of this talk, at the end of July in 1864, the population was depleted to about 2,500 people, and most of them were women, children, and older men. Thus, there were really only a few hundred men of military age in the town when McCausland arrived. Furthermore, these men had no uniforms. The residents argued that fighting without uniforms would provoke the Confederates to kill them on the spot as guerrillas. The big city papers had also criticized the residents for refusing to pay the ransom, as other cities had done, and thus saved their cities from destruction. In their defense, the residents argued that their banks had removed the money at the first sign that Confederates were on the way. And in any case, it was understood that the patriotic citizens had determined not to contribute 1 farthing to the maintenance of the accursed rebellion. The citizens of the city thus framed their refusal to pay and the destruction of Chambersburg as a consequence as a strategy to undermine the economic health of the Confederacy. A patriotic act, in their view. For the citizens of Chambersburg, then, proving their own patriotism became paramount in the days after the burning. The flood of letters, articles, and pamphlets that appeared in the wake of the city's ruination were part of a second wave of indignities they suffered in the summer of 1864. First, they saw many of their city's most important economic and political structures destroyed by vengeful Confederate incendiaries. Then they endured an assault from their own neighbors, an attack that questioned their decisions in a time of crisis and sparked a debate about the significance of cities and their destruction in wartime. John T. Trowbridge, a Northern journalist who toured Chambersburg in 1866, was initially shocked to see the skeletons of houses burned by the rebels, the empty eye sockets of their windows staring at him and yawning with their fanned and jagged jaws. But he quickly got over this aversion to the ruins and saw them as a sign of future strength. "There is no loss without gain," he wrote. "Chambersburg will in the end be greatly benefited by the fire. Let it be so with our country. Fearful as our loss has been, we shall build better anew." There was much of this positive rhetoric in the months after the burning. As the editors of the Franklin Depository urged in late August 1864, the city's residents must give new life to the charred homes and dismal ruins around us. Chambersburg must be rebuilt. Its stores must be replaced. Its shops must resound again with the sound of the anvil and the chisel. Its artisans must find the same demand for their handiwork and its professions, have the same duties today as they had a month ago. In short, the business of Chambersburg, in all of its various branches, must be restored. The editors of a rival newspaper, the Valley Spirit, were not so encouraging. "How the people are to live this winter, God only knows," they lamented. "Without stoves, coal, wood, bedding, furniture, clothing, flour, meat, in a word, all the necessities of life. And most of all, without a roof to shelter them from the pelting of the storms. Our people will only realize what they have lost and what hard times are when cruel winter comes. Those residents of Chambersburg who lost their property but stayed did make it through the first winter. Their destitution helped to plead their case with the state. With some state funds coming in and philanthropic donations, they did indeed rebuild much of the town, and fairly quickly. Ruins still remained in 1866, as Trowbridge's account attests, but architects and carpenters set to work almost immediately and reconstructed most of the diamond between 1864 and 1870. And in fact, so many carpenters, different carpenters and architects were at work doing this, that now, if you walk around Chambersburg, all of the buildings have a different kind of flair. It's not just built by one person. You can see about 10 different architectural styles just in a kind of 4-block radius. They rebuilt the Franklin County Courthouse, the most popular of the ruined images, using the existing columns and walls in 1865. So as you can see, and these, obviously the columns have been kind of replastered here, but it is a seamless integration of ruined and new architecture. There is a plaque noting the burning of the building, but that's all you would really, that's the only way you would really know if you didn't know the history when looking at this particular building. It is unclear how many buildings destroyed during the Civil War. The vast majority of them in the South were rebuilt in this way, literally out of the rubble. I mean, it seems reasonable that many of them would have been, right? Because there's all this brick sitting around, the wood is gone, but they have a lot of brick sitting around, some stone, they could rebuild and recycle, right? And I think this is, I suspect, this is actually what did happen in most destroyed southern towns and cities. But the residents of Chambersburg clearly saw their reconstruction effort as a kind of memorial to the burning. When they rebuilt the Chambersburg Bank, for example, they placed a brick from Fort Sumter somewhere in the structure. Its exact location remains a matter of debate. Other relics have turned up and are now displayed at the Chambersburg Heritage Center, like this charred timber and this warped teapot, which sit alongside an original printed first edition of B.S. Schneck's account, The Burning of Chambersburg. So we have all of these as sort of relics produced by the fire. In 1878, the town came together to dedicate a memorial fountain and statue in the middle of the reconstructed diamond, honoring the town's Civil War soldiers. The money for the fountain was raised by the ladies of the town, while the money for the soldier sculpture was raised by war veterans. The fountain in particular was meant to symbolize the town's regrowth after its destruction, and the soldier guards the gate, defending it against any rebels that might cross the border and attempt to assault the town again. Of course, he faces the south. A tablet across the road from the fountain and the statue, dedicated in 1893, notes the date of the town's founding, its burning by rebel cavalry, and the valuation of the property damage in buildings, real estate, and personal property. The destruction of the town, these few hours in late July 1864, overwhelmed the founding of Chambersburg or any other significant moment in its history as the central events in its past. And 9 days from now, the residents of Chambersburg will again gather in the diamond with Confederate cavalry. Again, they will listen to McCausland read Early's order. And again, they will watch with horror as the town is set aflame. They will be in period dress, of course. They will have been to the market day before, probably planning to go to the ball afterwards. McCausland will be portrayed by an amateur actor. The flames that will leap up from the buildings will be courtesy of a laser light show. And in fact, I was informed that they did a sort of practice run of this a couple days ago, and it alarmed several residents who called the fire department. And so the memory of the burning endures in Chambersburg. And so the marks of destruction remain. displayed in glass cases, absorbed into architecture, memorialized in stone and falling water, all of it a part of Chambersburg's landscape of Civil War memory. These fragments are a reminder of how central destruction was to the experience and the trajectory of the war in 1864, and how much we need to remember it. Thank you. Okay, so I think we have abundant time for questions. Yes, sir.
Two questions. Was money taken out of the banks before they burned it? Because
Yes.
the money was in there.
No, the money was removed.
It was
They'd already
removed.
sent it northward. Yep.
Okay. And the second question is, did they burn churches?
I believe so. Not all of them. I mean, this was one of these, they set the fires all around the town without respect to anything, really. And then fires spread, right? But I think some were saved, and they still are there, and have been sort of minded and kept up by the residents of Chambersburg since then. Yes?
Do a lot of the residents that did have ancestors from during this time period, do they have any sort of relics that were not in the area of part of the fires?
That's a really great question. I would imagine so. I mean, and I think that those would be either at the Chambersburg Heritage Center or the Historical Society, and that they have collected all kinds of items from the 18th century and from the colonial history of Chambersburg, and then certainly the time after the burning, for sure. But these particular kinds of relics are quite popular, right? Because they have kind of come from the fire and they have survived, which is our usual mode of remembering acts of destruction like this, is to sort of put in a case and admire these sort of fragments that have survived the destruction. But I imagine there are others that were untouched that are in the hands of the Historical Society there. All right? Yeah.
John Lestria, Chicago, Illinois. To harken back to your lecture 2 years ago about ruined bodies, and I'm going to talk specifically about the photographs that were taken of the ruined buildings here. Is there some sort of unique connection between the popularization of photographs of the dead during the Civil War and why photographers flocked to Chambersburg to take photos of the ruined buildings?
That's a really fantastic question. Yes, I think so. And I think what ruined bodies and ruined buildings share is, again, a sort of photogenic quality, right? In that they are still. Also, they represent the aftermath of the destruction, the sort of results of the destruction, and they share that. And if you look at a lot of the images, particularly the O'Sullivan and Gardner images of Gettysburg and Antietam, a lot of the bodies the photographs of them are taken from similar kinds of distances, a sort of mid-distance, so that you can see the scope of the destruction. And they're also often taken from an angle, so that you can see that this is a body, especially, I don't have a slide of it, but I'm sure you're all familiar with it, the Antietam photo of all the bodies lined up for burial in a kind of L shape. And there's a body at the end that has been turned, and this is one that people think probably the photographer messed with the body. And one of the reasons to do that is that it shows very starkly that they are the bodies of men, right? That they're not the bodies of something else, that they're not just sort of lumps of material. And there's the same effect in ruined buildings. If you were to take some of those photographs of just the front, it might actually look, because it's just a facade, it might look just like a whole building, but you have to take it from the side to show that there is nothing else there. So yes, I think there are a lot of connections between the aesthetic qualities of bodies and buildings and the photography of this period. Yeah, great question. Yes, sir.
Hi, I have two questions. One of them is, did Governor Curtin mobilize surprised the Pennsylvania militia at all. Around the Gettysburg campaign, there were about 20,000 of them in Harrisburg, and it appears that Early's eruption towards Washington would have provoked the same response. And then the second question is it really hard war that is being waged, or is it mercenary war, since these were ransom was requested? So that's two questions.
Those are great questions. I don't know about the militia. Certainly in the reports of the residents, they never appear in any of the accounts. So clearly they were not there in the moment and were not dispatched. So it could be that they had been diverted to deal with Early's raid and had sort of stayed operating in some other area. And that would actually be a great question for Katie Meyer. She might know kind of how those forces were sort of brought together and moved against him in that way. That's an interesting question. I don't think I've ever heard mercenary war sort of as a term. Can you just, I know you're not at the microphone any longer, but can you kind of expand a little bit on what you mean by that?
What I'm thinking of is by defining it as sort of war by profit. In other words, by asking for ransom. It goes back to what I've read in a lot of documents about seacoast cities being ransomed by naval forces, Alexandria, Virginia during the War of 1812, things like that. So that's the idea of a mercenary war. So I'm wondering if this is more of that rather than a vengeance. Because if you paid, your town was left alone.
Right. And it was a plan for profit, although it was meant as a punishment, right? And then if they didn't pay, then this destruction would happen. But I think that's true. I mean, that is, they could have just looted the town. They could have taken everything, any supplies that they may have needed. They could have taken wagons and horses and anything that they thought that perhaps they could sell for money. So to say either it's money or destruction does have that valence, does have that mercenary quality to it. But I like that sort of twist on hard war. That's very useful. Thank you. Yes?
So it sounds like the town revived fairly quickly economically, but was there any lasting political resentment towards the state government for lack of protection that they just didn't get?
I'm not sure if there was, I mean, it was certainly resentment. They kept, the residents kept filing claims throughout the 1870s and the 1880s, and they kept producing accounts of Chambersburg, especially around the anniversaries, which is very popular. I think that's quite common in other contexts. I'm not sure if that translated politically, if certain officials were ousted, or if this was about the sort of state military power and their lack of support for the town. But that's a great question. Yes.
I have a question about the rebuilding of the...
Could you speak a little bit on the mic there?
I'm sorry, I have a question about the rebuilding of the city after the state legislature gave $500,000 to do so. The amount of money estimated was about $1.75 million, something like that, between the building and the specs of the population. I assume the rest of the money is from the local people. That's an awful lot of money in 6 years to be able to rebuild the whole thing. Do they have that kind of money?
Well, I think what was happening is that they got that first initial kind of slug of money. It was sort of divvied up depending on claims and percentages. And so each person who owned property got a certain amount based on that and based on the committee's report. So they would use that, and if that was not enough, they had to supplement using other funds. And I think part of it was helped by the fact that they had sent the money away. And so if anyone had any money or valuables that they could cash in or draw upon, then when the money came back to Chambersburg, they could possibly use that. Also, there were philanthropic organizations that were sending aid, religious organizations that were helping. But also, I think what we see in the wake of the destruction here also is that some of the rebuilding was a tad bit shoddy. Right? The quality may not have been quite reproduced to the same extent. So people did what they could with the money that they had, especially in that first year. If they needed to put a roof over their head, they put a roof over their head, no matter what it was and what it looked like. Yes. A great question. Thanks. Yes.
Yes, Steve Perry from Newton, Mass. Question. What if rather than the Confederates going to Chambersburg, what if they had returned to Gettysburg? Would that have succeeded, and what do you think would have been the aftermath of that destruction?
Oh, I don't know. You know, counterfactuals are fun to think about because we can muse about all the different possibilities. I'm not sure what the citizens of Gettysburg would have done in response to that particular threat, and it is quite interesting. I mean, Gettysburg was close also, right? It was in the line of fire, so why go to Chambersburg and not Gettysburg? I think it would have really depended on how many residents were in the town and if they had any money available and if they were going to kind of play ball with McCausland and pay up to protect the town, or whether they would have said, or if they would have been more successful in getting Union soldiers to come to their aid, given the reputation of the town. But we can probably spin out all kinds of different possibilities with that question. Yes?
Do we know about injuries to the locals?
There were some injuries, mostly from people who were fleeing away from the town, and they're just sort of minor injuries. There wasn't, I don't think there were any reports of any deaths, so there was enough time to get people out, and they had known that the rebels were on the border, and that because the sentries had come in and told everyone that the rebels are here, and because they did get those very useful couple of shells thrown into the city as a warning, they were able to get out in time. Yes.
Frank Sturt, Morganville, New Jersey. In view of the concept of retaliation, was Chambersburg, in your view, used as a direct justification in a strategic planning for Sherman's renovation of Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina?
Can you repeat the middle part? Was it a justification for the destruction at Sherman?
For the strategic planning for Sherman's march to renovate Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina.
Mm-hmm. If Sherman actually directly talked about Chambersburg in his planning?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. That would be an excellent question for Anne Sarah Rubin, actually, who has written about Sherman's march and the destruction on that march. Anne, do you have any?
I'm not aware of it.
Okay.
He has his own reasons for what he's doing.
Mm-hmm. And Sherman had developed that kind of hard war policy and that approach of using destruction as a punishment. He had developed that really early on in the war, before Chambersburg even happened. But there were soldiers who were on that march. You know, the quote that I gave you, that Chambersburg is dearly paid for. So some soldiers clearly saw it because this was a very rare example of a southern burning of a northern town. So maybe they saw the march itself and the destruction wreaked upon Georgia and South Carolina as revenge for Chambersburg. It's probably more likely they saw it as revenge for actual secession. And certainly in South Carolina, soldiers themselves expressed a delight in destroying the cradle of the Confederacy because they viewed South Carolinians as having brought the war upon them. Thanks. And I think we have one more question.
Why did it stop? Why did we not see further cities burned in the same kind of mercenary manner?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think because Early and McCausland both withdrew back into Virginia, and they were occupied, fighting the Union Army. And so that particular strategy did not move forward from that point on. But Confederates certainly did their fair share of burning kind of throughout the war in all kinds of different contexts. And They didn't have the opportunity as much in the north because they just weren't there for very long, but they did burn Southern Unionist households and parts of towns, and then some Southern towns were destroyed in the context of battles, like Fredericksburg.
For a monetary reason?
Not for a monetary reason.
Or
No, just as the kind of, as the fortunes of war, or for punishment. I mean, there was a lot of, soldiers took great joy in acts of revenge, where, on both sides. Either kind of, a kind of actual retaliation in kind in the field, or because these were the houses of prominent Confederates, or this is the house of a woman who spit at us, or, that kind of vengeful action. But that was more individually directed. It usually didn't take the form of the destruction of an entire city or part of a city. Thank you. All right, thank you guys very much.